Okay, so what type of mitigation and adaptation efforts can we see from the Australian recent experience, and how specifically has the national security infrastructure within Australia discussed and this issue, and how are they trying to address through either mitigation or adaptation the challenges that we're going to see from the types of changes we've already seen, right? So a couple of things I mentioned in the last section that Australian installed solar capacity has increased dramatically. You see the Australia there is now in gigawatts, surpassing much larger countries population wise, like Mexico and Brazil, and is up there with India, China, and just the global total global amount for solar energy capacity. It's increased quite dramatically in recent years. We have solar panels on our roof of our rental property here, and it's great given that I'm working from home now during the pandemic. I don't have to worry about how much energy we're drawing. We're usually feeding money into the grid over time, although that amount is a lot less than what we're charged when we actually use. The one thing that I don't have is a solar battery to be able to store this energy for nighttime when we want to fire up the stove, or watch Netflix, or turn on all our lights, or turn on our heater or air conditioner or whatever. And storage capacity has been an ongoing issue. We saw with the trial in South Australia, batteries can outperform in the provision of short-term energy needs. I know there's a couple of neighborhoods around Canberra where you now have and around Australia, in which you have building standards that would encourage the use of solar panels and batteries. ACT government has talked about installing a large solar a battery system to try to keep some of that solar power that's being generated, and hopefully the subsidies will be there so we can afford it at some time in the future for in our household. But right now, you got to deal with what we have, but it's still an improvement over what we had in the past. Where the global venture capital is going is often indicative of what businesses see is likely to be important going forward. And so you have this report from 5 years ago looking at California, but this is a lot of where the VCs are based, and they invest money around the world. Global venture capital in 2014 was over $11 billion, and you see half of that now going into clean transportation, less towards agriculture, 6%, energy storage, as I mentioned earlier, is just 4%, recycling and waste, which we talked about with the food production, still a fraction of that. And transportation, while it's definitely one of the major drivers, like with cars, of CO2 emissions, you have also other sectors that don't get as much attention. Energy generation is up there, but agricultural agricultural waste is also something that doesn't get as much of attention. Two initiatives that governments at a subnational and national level have taken to try to mitigate the effects of climate change through reducing CO2 emissions. Cap and trade is basically a pretty underlying a simple idea that you cap the amount of emissions that can be allowable within a certain area, whether it's a city, a state, or a country, and then a certain groups are allocated a certain amount of capacity. Those that don't need all that capacity to pollute can trade it to a different business who needs that extra capacity to generate greenhouse gases. And then through that trading system, it should theoretically make it easier and provide economic incentives to become more have a better idea of who's generating what, and then thereby generally lower it. The California cap decreases 3% every year past 2013. And so you cap the amount of emissions, and then you slowly decrease that cap, and that provides incentives to come up with market solutions to reducing global greenhouse emissions. Another way at trying to reduce those emissions is by putting a price on carbon. From 2012 to 2019, the last time I checked, there was a jump in the amount of different efforts at different levels to put a price on carbon from 20 to 57. And the idea is that you tax the carbon that's being produced in order to provide economic incentives to try to reduce the amount you're either producing or that you're using. And there's a lot of different measures in a lot of different parts of the world. This New York Times article provides that kind of a graph of the different areas that are producing, including all of Europe. Australia had an experiment, which we're going to look at in a second. The U.S. has subnational efforts. In the U.S., there's not a regional association, like I mentioned earlier, could be either cross-national or subnational. 9 northeastern states in the U.S. has put a price on carbon of CO2 emissions of $5 per metric ton. That covers 18% of the emissions in that area. The California is even more ambitious. They put a price that's triple that, and that covers 85% of emissions covered. Canada also has a range of different efforts that prices that go from California's up to double that, and the emissions depending on provinces are quite higher. So you do have Anglo-Saxon countries either at the subnational level experimenting with different prices per on CO2 emissions to try to reduce it. Compare that to Australia. We did have carbon pricing for a couple of years until 2014, and then that basically ended. And you can see the growth of carbon pricing initiatives has been quite dramatic. So even in my lifetime, there's been a sea change in the recognition of the issues and the market-based solutions to it that have been proposed and encouraged by different governments in different parts of the world. And just since 2005, there's been a dramatic growth in the number of initiatives in different parts of the world. And it shows that even in the lack of government responses, you can have mitigation efforts that the marketplace can dictate just because of the price of producing different forms of energy can change to the point that it can actually become cheaper to use things that have an effect of mitigating climate emissions but can be driven by purely profit-seeking enterprise. So a little bit more about the carbon tax. This is definitely before you guys got into college. I don't know how many of you saw that are into university. College is different here than university, but in school and in college. But it was the first explicit national tax on carbon emissions anywhere. The tax level of $23 per metric ton was one of the highest in the world before it was repealed. It was also precedent-setting, and it got a lot of international attention that you have this expectation that once you implement them, it's not a policy that can be changed, but it was repealed after the change in government in 2014. Brief kind of timeline for this, for those of you who haven't seen this before in other areas, in other classes or other topics. 97, we refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. 2002, the UK adopted an emissions trading scheme, kind of like the cap and trade description that I showed to you in a second. Then the UK joined the EU scheme in 2005. John Howard also proposed an emissions trading scheme. Often these trading schemes, because of market-based solutions, were seen as attracting people who would be center-right policymakers that would see this as a way of reducing the government's involvement in it and have it more of a market-based solution. Prime Minister Rudd ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2007. He also proposed a cap-and-trade scheme the year later, which was voted down, and because of opposition in the Senate, they stopped trying to impose an emissions trading scheme. Carbon tax, however, passed the Senate a year later. The carbon tax began in the middle of 2012 and was repealed pretty much to the day 2 years later. And while Rudd, before the election, planned to terminate the tax and replace it with an emissions trading scheme, ended up neither one of them were existing past 2014. And you could see with the carbon pricing scheme from when it was brought into effect in the middle of 2012 that coal as a share of energy generation went down quite dramatically until 2014, in which it was repealed. And then you see in that pink line an increase in coal generation as the amount of as the tax was repealed. So you see quite a dramatic, just kind of visceral response to this carbon tax, having the desired effect of reducing the total amount of emissions related to fuel sources that generated these emissions. And then with the policy change, it started going back up to where it was before. I don't have the graph past 2016 to see whether it has meted or exceeded 2012 levels. Pretty much it's likely in the last 4 years that's exceeded that amount. You can see that cost related to electrical prices during this time frame, that it did have a follow-on effect on people's pocketbooks, and that shaped the individual responses that put pressure on parties, right? So you see this implementation of the carbon price. It was still going up before then, before the carbon price was instituted, but the speed in which it came slightly higher. It went down after the carbon price was repealed, but then in 2015, 2016, you saw this just as steep increase in prices over the past couple of years. So you have a dramatic policy level effect, but then with other things happening, the prices have ended up going up as well. So lots of graphs, basically trying to take away that these governmental policies are trying to mitigate climate affecting emissions had a dramatic effect. Market level mechanisms had an effect, and governmental efforts in their reducing the amount of coal being produced. It was already going down. Then after 2014, it started going back up, while brown coal production has gone down in recent years. But you do see that other sources of energy generation have continued to slowly climb, with wind and solar and hydro kind of staying more or less constant. So you have governmental efforts, market mechanisms, as well as us as individuals, all kind of shaping this. Shifting now to the national security aspects of mitigation and adaptation, I want to try to contrast the Australian approach to the U.S. approach, which we're going to look at in the next section. But there has been a recognition by militaries around the world looking at the kind of national security threats that we've seen in this class of population movements, increasing scarcity, and just their operation costs from providing fuel. There is a practical aspect at trying to look at these mitigation adaptation efforts. So for the assigned reading, I had you read a bit about this Climate Council, a bit of this Climate Council report. You saw the video of one of the writers talking about this before this section. And you see that in this report, they're kind of echoing the stuff that the ADF hasn't come up with any kind of recent reports recently, probably for obvious reasons, at looking at the impact of this. But you can see this report showing that climate change presents capability risks for undermining defense preparedness and readiness through flooding and heat waves that can hurt infrastructure. Same thing that would apply to regular governments, as opposed to in addition to the security parts of governments. And it can undermine defense sustainment. Increasing heat puts troops' health at risk. Geostrategically, it alters the mission, more disaster relief because of the kind of flooding that we've seen, as well as people moving to try to get away from these disasters, as the Australian military has come out and said. it's putting pressure on the ADF in a bunch of different areas, right? The Asia Pacific region is the primary environment in which we have to worry about providing for our national security. And you can see here, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the different climatic challenges that the Defense Force has to face. And I think it's going to be echoed in next week, in which you see militaries trying to operate in the Arctic, in trying to learn how to deal with climatic extremes, different kind of extremes, but that also require national security response. One of the main takeaways from this report is how the U.S. and the U.K.'s Ministry of Defense, or the Department of Defense, are farther along at trying to analyzing and observing and assessing the risks facing their defense forces. And it was one of the calls of action in this report to kind of say that the ADF has to kind of provide this observation and assessment. Maybe they've done it and not made it public, but the reliance on the ADF to provide national security and addressing non-traditional threats is something that is one of those things that could affect human security as well as national security. There was an explicit military response in 2011 to raise awareness and develop an integrated way of trying to provide energy sources. Usually the military is one of the largest purchasers of energy products like petroleum, and so they are reliant on the global marketplace to provide that as well. Pushing towards green procurement to try to mitigate the amount of resources that they were using, and they are still the first responder for natural and man-made disasters, as the previous graph showed. What's I think really interesting, I don't know, maybe if those of you who are taking security studies across campus have talked about the National Security Strategy in 2013 and how governments determine what their national security strategy is. In the Australian Institute for International Affairs, in ASPRI, in Lowy Institute, I know there's a lot of people who have thought about what's in Australia's national security interests, where the threats are. Often those are private, and they have by private institutions or people who might have formerly worked in government. But a national security strategy, like in the U.S., George W. Bush put out one after 9/11 that changed the U.S.'s definition of what the major security threats are to the U.S. national security. The Obama administration changed in their post George W. Bush national security strategy. We've kind of moved away from that here in Australia. There was one in 2008, the last one that I can find that I believe exists is the 2013 National Security Strategy, which I've heard doesn't even exist on any government websites anymore, and there's been increasing calls to try to update it for the 2020s. But this is a kind of summary of the government's beliefs where our strategic interests lie and where we should put our priorities. And these are a couple of screenshots from that 2013 report. So the vision is a unified national security system that anticipates threats, protects the nation, and shapes the world in Australia's interest. And you have the objectives, the risks, right, that we talked about earlier, what the risks are, what the costs are if the risk is eventuated, and the probability of that actually occurring, and what the pillars of Australian national security are, right? And it's really interesting. If you read through the entire document, I only found the climate mentioned 4 times in that 2013 report. Climate change represented a broader global challenge with national security implications, but there really wasn't any kind of recognition of how the climate could affect national security from an internal readiness perspective, which I thought was interesting. And that kind of leads me to my third lecture question for the week, that there have been calls for a new national security strategy. Would you include climate change as a key national security risk? Why or why not, right? Should there be a fundamental change in the perception of how we define national security risk, or are the kind of factors that we've talked about in this class basically work from that kind of layer removed from the kind of risks that were included in the 2013 report, that they can exacerbate the kind of risks that existed in the 2013 report, and so you still want to keep things largely the same? Or does it represent something that's qualitatively different that could have both global as well as national and regional effects? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So if you can go on Waddle, it'd be interesting to read your perspective. And yeah, in the next couple of years, we'll see if one is forthcoming. So yeah, that is a couple of points about Australian mitigation and adaptation efforts through both market mechanisms as well as government policy. And now we'll shift in the next section to talk about the USA.